It's been 12 years since Django Unchained hit theaters, and man, it is still so good. Samuel L. Jackson and Leonardo DiCaprio give some of their best performances, the almost 3-hour runtime flies by, and of course, it deconstructs the ideology of chattel slavery like only a Tarantino revisionist revenge fantasy can. Bringing agency to the oppressed through a badass protagonist? Check. A satisfying reversal of power dynamics? Check. Hyper-stylized violence and cathartic justice? Oh yeah. But Django and Schultz's odyssey through the antebellum South doesn't only undermine the vile institution, but also the means by which it was justified. The film reveals that anything, religion, science, and even the idea of progress itself can be twisted to rationalize oppressive social relations. And I think the most interesting lesson in this vein comes when they arrive at the ultimate symbol of the horrors of slavery, Candyland Plantation. What makes Calvin Candy such an enduring villain isn't just his depraved cruelty and meme-worthy expressions, but also the fact that, unlike many other villains representing barriers to social emancipation, Calvin legitimately thinks he's progressive.
Is I believe there is a level above bright, above talented, above loyal that a can aspire to. But I do believe that given time, exceptional Bright boy here become, if not frequent, more frequent.
Let's dive in. But first, a quick recap. Django Unchained follows bounty hunter King Schultz and slave Django, who team up when Schultz purchases him to help claim a bounty. This leads them to Big Daddy's plantation, where they successfully hunt down and kill the notorious Brittle brothers. After the deed is done, Schultz frees Django, and together they vow to find and liberate Django's wife Brumhilda. Their quest leads them through the violent and morally backwards social landscape of the antebellum South, ultimately bringing them to Candyland Plantation, where Brumhilda is being held by the nefarious Calvin Candy and his head slave Steven. Their attempt to cleverly outwit Calvin and buy Brumhilda's freedom takes a dark turn, resulting in a shootout that claims the lives of both Schultz and Calvin. Django is captured and sentenced to hard labor at a mining company, but en route he outsmarts his captors and returns to Candyland to liberate Brumhilda. Django saves her, kills all the slavers on the plantation, and burns the place to the ground. All hail Django, the fastest gun in the West. The end. I want to start off with an interesting comparison Schultz draws between slavery and bounty hunting.
The way the slave trade deals in human lives for cash, a bounty hunter deals in corpses.
Another way to say this is that Django goes from being a subject of state-sanctioned violence perpetuated to maintain property rights to being an agent of state-sanctioned violence perpetuated to maintain property rights. While this may seem like a tenuous parallel, it actually reflects something quite poignant about the history of race, because both bounty hunting and race were concepts created for similar reasons. In his book, The Meaning of Race, philosopher of biology Kenan Malik claims that race is a concept created to serve certain political needs and perpetuate certain social relations. In his words, the fact that we use certain physical characteristics such as skin color to define a race but ignore others such as hair texture, height, or ear size shows that the creation of race is a product of social need, not biological fact. Through his exhaustive study on the literature of race throughout history, Malik comes to the conclusion that it is not racial categorization, but the social needs of modern society that impel it to restrict the concept of equal rights. Basically, it wasn't an understanding of actual existing difference that created the concept of race. Rather, the necessity to perpetuate existing social divisions and protect property rights led to widespread adoption of racial categorization as a means of justifying restrictions to freedom and inequality. Per Malik, economic utility and the desire not to challenge property rights, not racial ideas, gave rise to Western ambivalence about slavery. Slavery, like bounty hunting, although not moral equivalents, were both violent institutions that were fabricated in the interest of maintaining existing social dynamics. Django's transition from slave to bounty hunter vividly depicts the moral landscape of the time that emphasized the primacy of economic utility.
How do you like the bounty hunting business?
Kill white folks and they pay you for it? What's not to like?
But of course, the status quo required something to make this unnatural division seem natural. It required legitimation in the forms of ideology, claims to progress, and science, and Django Unchained shows us all of them. For example, when Django and Schultz reach Big Daddy's plantation in search of the Brittle brothers, Django has flashbacks of one of them torturing his wife while holding the Bible. When Django finds John Brittle at Big Daddy's, he's at it again, this time quoting it.
And the Lord said, the fear of ye and the dread of ye.
Historically, the Bible was cited as a means to justify slavery. Now, to be fair, it was also cited as an argument against slavery, but that's kind of the point. Anything can be twisted to justify the status quo. One famous biblical justification was the curse of Ham in Genesis. Noah curses his grandson Canaan, the son of Ham, to be a, quote, servant of servants. Pro-slavery advocates extended this curse of servitude to all of Ham's descendants who they arbitrarily identified as Africans. When Django shoots John, the bullet pierces a page of the Bible, not only symbolically dismantling slavery, but one of the forces that legitimized it.
I like the way you die, boy.
Now, it's important to note the year the movie takes place, 1858, just before the Civil War. During that decade, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, and the Dred Scott case dominated headlines, making claims to African American equality increasingly prominent in the public sphere. The abolitionist movement drew heavily from European Enlightenment ideas like reason, science, and equality, so to adjust to the changing cultural landscape, some slavers sought a new way to legitimize slavery, a way that allowed them to maintain a veneer of sophistication while positing that existing inequality was natural and inevitable. Enter Candyland. Calvin is obsessed with projecting an image of European refinement. He desperately tries to build a false contrast between himself, the cultured gentleman, and the supposedly primitive blacks.
You even know what reimburse means?
Huh?
Calvin gives his slaves European names like Mercedes.
Mercedes.
He hangs out with Italians. This, by the way, is Franco Nero, star of the original Django.
The D is silent.
I know.
His staff plays Beethoven on the harp.
Could you please stop playing Beethoven?
He proudly declares himself a Francophile,
Yes, he is a bit of a Francophile.
and even names one of his slaves D'Artagnan after a character in Dumas' The Three Musketeers. However, one of the funniest elements of the movie is how obviously unsophisticated Calvin is. Beneath this painfully obvious ruse, Candyland is riddled with clues that expose the artificiality of this racial division.
He needs to have panache.
Yeah, what?
Panache.
Sense of showmanship.
Showmanship.
First of all, Calvin can't speak French.
Si c'est cela qu'il préfère.
He doesn't speak French. Don't speak French to him. It'll embarrass him.
He doesn't even know who Dumas is.
Come again.
Alexandre Dumas. He wrote The Three Musketeers.
Has definitely not read The Three Musketeers, and didn't know that Dumas was black.
Alexandre Dumas is black.
He mispronounces even the simplest German expressions,
Wunderbar.
and his servants wear hats indoors.
You don't wear a hat in the house, white man. Even I know that.
There's a poignant contrast made between Schultz, the actually sophisticated European dentist with pearly whites, and Calvin, the poser with horrible teeth, who merely appropriates the culture to justify his position.
Prost.
German.
Just as the bullet that kills John pierces the Bible, the bullet that kills Calvin pierces his flower, his fake elegance. Another clever element is the white rednecks on the plantation, whose slack-jawed demeanor very clearly upsets the assumption of white superiority and reveals just how arbitrary this division is.
That's all not.
Malik notes that race wasn't always synonymous with skin color. In fact, the concept is so vague and malleable that at one point, discussions about race were oriented around differences within a society. Per Malik, what we would now consider class or social distinctions were once seen as racial ones. Even Stephen has to put on an elaborate performance to play the role of the subservient inferior. He affects a limp and falsely relies on a cane, but once all the slavers are dead, he just drops it and stands upright to face Django. He laughs way too hard at Calvin's god-awful jokes.
Well, hell, I can't imagine 2 weeks in Boston.
2 weeks in Boston.
And the first time we see him, he's forging Calvin's signature on a check. Basically, Stephen is running the show. His feebleness is a performance that legitimates Calvin's perceived superiority. Pretending to be inferior is part of the job. Side note, I just love how it's the fact that Stephen has been performing his whole life that enables him to see through Django and Schultz's performance as Mandingo fighting enthusiasts.
Why is you lying to me?
But beyond adorning himself in the symbols of European sophistication to make his superiority seem natural, Calvin also uses one of the main tools of the Enlightenment, science. Malik notes that after the Enlightenment, there was a demand for a new legitimator for existing social relations. Religion was old hat at this point, so in order to reconcile belief in social progress while maintaining the status quo, science became the new legitimator of existing property laws, i.e. slavery. As Malik states, for racial theory to become embedded in society, it had to shed its feudal trappings and put on the mask of science. Calvin fancies himself a phrenologist.
The science of phrenology is crucial to understanding the separation of our two species.
Or the discredited idea originating from Austrian anatomist Johann Franz Gall that there exists a correlation between skull shape and mental ability. After Stephen clues him in on Django and Schultz's deception, Calvin gives them a little phrenology lesson to explain in pseudo-scientific language why people with dark skin are naturally more subservient. It's tempting to think of this moment as a dropping of the progressive facade, where Calvin shamelessly reveals his regressive nature, but according to Malik, it wasn't really like that. An argument could be made that it's also part of the progressive act, because, believe it or not, race science was considered quite progressive at the time. While we might think of racial science as the tool of backwards-looking bad faith reactionaries, Malik points out that the discipline was supported by some of the foremost thinkers of the age, the politically liberal, progressive, pro-modern, and scientifically minded elite. Phrenologists were involved in a number of reform movements in the 1840s, including women's education, improving mental health facilities, and the popular health movement. Some even thought that phrenology could enable individualized education programs tailored to one's strengths and weaknesses. And yet, the legacy of their work is anything but progressive. It justified one of the most barbaric institutions of human degradation the world has ever seen. Now, of course, like all the rest of Calvin's attempts to adopt the facade of progress, he was not using science to advance humanity, but that's not the point. The point is, Django Unchained reminds us that anything, religion, science, and even movements about equality can be put in the service of maintaining oppressive social relations. Unlike a lot of other films about the triumphs of social progress, Django shows us that the barriers to liberation aren't always donning the mantle of backwards-looking, hard-nosed conservatism. Sometimes it's done in the name of progress. Take the movie Selma about MLK Jr. and the 1965 voting rights marches. Tim Roth plays Alabama Governor George Wallace, whose arguments for segregation are bound in maintaining tradition and the status quo.
We have a certain way things are done. It's the way it is. It's the way the people want it to stay.
Or similarly in The Help, there's a contrast between the anti-racist Skeeter, an independent thinking journalist reflecting women's emerging roles in the workplace, and Hilly Holbrook, the cruel segregationist racist who represents the more traditional role of the socialite homemaker. Civil rights movies are full of these binaries between the good people donning the mantle of progress and the bad people resisting it, and for good reason, as it accurately portrays the sentiments of the time. After all, it's crucial to valorize the hard-won fights for liberation, and movies, as purveyors of ideology, can give us a lens through which we understand our society's moral evolution and foster a sense of moral cohesion amongst the population. But there's a risk that this binary gets interpreted as claims to progress always yield progress, that questioning claims to progress means aligning yourself with the villains of history. And while Calvin Candy is a humorous example of how some declarations to progress are obviously not, it is nevertheless an important reminder that it's the verdict of history that renders something progress, not calling you or your project progressive. When history renders its judgment, it's strict and unforgiving. So while signing up for things that label themselves progressive may seem like a safe bet, History is indifferent to such designations. Eugenicists in the early 20th century labeled themselves progressive and included some of the most revered liberal thinkers of the age: Bertrand Russell, Margaret Sanger, Helen Keller, John Maynard Keynes, Havelock Ellis, Julian Huxley, George Bernard Shaw, and H.G. Wells, just to name a few, were all proponents of improving the human race through eugenics and selective breeding. On the other hand, the quote, regressive Catholic Church was against eugenics and sterilization. In this case, history ruled in favor of the religious. Central to the ideological potency of movies is their ability to arm us with moral clarity about the past so we can apply it to the present. They offer us the fantasy that by aligning ourselves with the moral victories of the past, we can ensure that we position ourselves on the correct side of moral development. But the actions we take today in the name of progress are judged by their impact, with history as the ultimate arbiter. Whether or not something is truly progressive is a verdict delivered retrospectively. And I think that's key to the appeal of Tarantino's revisionist fantasies. The unique combination of being both highly moral and highly subversive stories gives Tarantino license to step outside the prescribed symbolic understanding of moral progress and show some of the messier elements. Part of what makes Hans Landa so captivating is that, unlike Calvin, he is legitimately cultured. Imagine presenting a refined, oddly charming World War II villain without the genre film exaggeration and hyperstylization. Yeah, it wouldn't work, and yet, it's crucial we not forget some of them were wildly sophisticated. My intent is not to trivialize the fight for progress. On the contrary, the unequivocal moral and cultural triumph of anti-slavery and civil rights makes their legacy all the more appealing for the powerful to co-opt, and thus all the more important for us to critically interrogate in good faith. So just as we should be vigilant when evaluating claims made in the name of faith or science, we should be similarly vigilant about claims to progress. Is normalizing obesity an act of anti-colonialist liberation?
The idea that we cannot govern our own bodies is rooted in European colonization. Diet culture is not rooted in health, it's rooted in power.
Or is it a corporate ideology that gives a progressive veneer to the peddling of heavily processed addictive foods that perpetuate disease? Are disinformation ratings agencies essential tools to combat bad actors who falsify information to push a nefarious agenda? Or are they a convenient means to systematically silence dissent? Or both? Not only do we not want to be remembered as one of the George Wallaces of history, but we also really don't want to be remembered as one of the Calvin Candies. Hey y'all, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. If you appreciate the content and want to support it continuing on, be sure to check out my Ko-fi page where you can donate. Check me out on Twitch, where I'm currently playing Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. Follow me on Letterboxd, join the Discord. All those links are in the description below, so be sure to click them all, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.